Welcome to the Megillah Project.
One story, many angles.
Come learn with us.
The Megillah is how Jews call the Book of Esther. And the Book of Esther is the text that we read on the holiday of Purim, which usually comes around March in the yearly calendar. The Book of Esther is part of the Jewish Bible. It's in the third section of the Jewish Bible. I can show you here by using Sefaria. If you go to sefaria.org, you'll see the Tanakh, which is the three parts of the Jewish Bible. And the Book of Esther is found in the third part, the Ch part, the writings. And you'll see it here. It comes following what is actually 5 Megillahs. The word Megillah just means scroll, and it refers to these 5 texts which were written on their own scrolls. And each of those texts is associated with a certain holiday in the yearly Jewish calendar. The Book of Esther is probably the most famous Megillah. It's the most famous of the 5 scrolls. It's the text we read on the holiday of Purim, and therefore we just call it the Megillah. Now, the Book of Esther is probably the most famous of the Megillahs because it has such a good story. It's a story with lots of characters and lots of drama. It starts in the land of Shushan with a king named Achashverosh. It says, it happened in the days of Achashverosh, that Achashverosh, who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. We are taken right away into a story that takes place in the famous ancient Persian Empire. And we're taken right to the heart of the palace, to the king, Achashverosh, who's throwing a party, as one does. And King Achashverosh asks his wife, the Queen Vashti, to come dance at that party, wearing only her crown. And Queen Vashti refuses. When she refuses, the text is a little bit ambiguous here. She somehow gets sent away. We're not sure how. And King Achashverosh starts a search for a new queen. Now, how does one have a search for a new queen? Well, of course, you throw a beauty pageant. And so the story continues with a beauty pageant where one special girl gets chosen to be the new queen. Her name is Queen Esther, and Esther is Jewish. Now, Esther comes from a family where she's been orphaned and she's been raised by her uncle Mordechai. And when she gets chosen to be the new queen to King Achashverosh in the city of Shushan in the ancient Persian Empire, her uncle Mordechai tells Esther, you probably shouldn't tell the king that you're a Jew. And so she doesn't. And this Jewess, unbeknownst to the king, becomes the queen of all of ancient Persia. Now, simultaneously, there is a plot going on in the story, a plot against the king's life. And first, there is a plot from these 2 men, these 2 courtiers who are secretly planning to assassinate the king. Mordechai, that very same Mordechai, Esther's uncle, overhears this plot and makes it known to the king that the king is going to be killed. And then the king forgets about this, but you, the reader, should keep this in the back of your mind because this is where the plot thickens. Now, here's another plot line. The king's advisor, Haman, who is a character whenever we hear his name, we try to sound it out with these groggers, one of the reasons that Purim is such a fun holiday. Haman wants to kill all of the Jews. And this vengeance, Haman's vengeance against the Jews, only heightens when Mordechai finally gets his reward for having saved the king's life, and in getting rewarded, receives some accolades and a parade and kudos that Haman thinks are due to himself, to Haman. And so Haman is getting angrier and angrier. And so it seems like all of the Jews are going to be killed. Now, this is where Mordechai comes up with a plan, because of course there is a Jew in the heart of the palace, the very same Queen Esther. And in chapter 4, Mordecai has a message sent to the queen so that she can go and have this wretched plot against the Jews be stopped. And he says this very, very, very famous line. Mordecai had this message delivered to Esther. Do not imagine that you, of all the Jews, will escape with your life by being in the king's palace. You're also going to be killed, dear Esther, Mordecai says. So on the contrary, you're not going to be saved. If you keep silent in this crisis, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another quarter, while you and your father's house will perish. And who knows, perhaps you have attained to royal position for just such a crisis. Mordecai says to Esther, you're not going to be saved just because you're the queen. And don't worry, the Jewish people will live on whether you help us or not. But don't you think that perhaps you were the queen for just this moment? This inspires Esther, and so Esther goes and through a series of sort of maneuvers, as one does as queen, she gains access to a visit with the king and is able to confess that she herself is a Jew and that this wicked advisor, Haman, has been secretly plotting to kill her whole people and perhaps even herself. And so the king, beguiled by his wife, Queen Esther, agrees that this can't be and puts a stop to Haman's evil plan. And Haman, in fact, himself gets hanged in the public square, and all of the Jews are able to seek revenge against those who had been plotting their destruction. And thus, it is a happy day for the Jews who are saved once again. So that's the story of the Book of Esther, of the Megillah, and it's a great one. There's so many different ways of accessing this text and finding it interesting, so many open questions, so many opportunities for interpretation. Here are a few. One of the first most basic questions you might think to ask about the Book of Esther is, what is the genre of this text? Is this a historical text telling us something that actually happened? And if so, then what do we make of it? What do we make of the war? What can we understand about Jews in ancient Persia in this time? What can we understand from the Persian context to help us better understand this text, if it is indeed a historical document? Or is it perhaps more of a folk story, some lore? We, in fact, on Purim each year, act out this story in a Purim spiel. Might the Book of Esther itself been the first Purim spiel, and it includes some exaggerated details and some farcical theatrical elements that might make this text actually more of a presentation than a historical record? How does this book fit into the context of the Jewish Bible? How is it different and how is it the same? There are certain elements that will seem familiar, like a Jew rising in a foreign court. You might remember that from the story of Joseph, who himself rose in the court of Egypt. But there are other elements of this text which are super unique. This is the only text that takes place in the Persian Empire. It seems to be a later text. When did it get added to the biblical canon, and why? We might also ask some pretty deep questions about the content. Noteworthy, and many people have written much about this, God is not mentioned at all in the Book of Esther. At all. Does that make this a secular text? How does that make the Book of Esther fit into the Torah at all? Why would we even include a book that doesn't mention God? Not to mention it doesn't mention God, or on top of the fact that it doesn't mention God, it also doesn't mention the land of Israel. This is a book that takes place in the diaspora. There's no temple, and there's no call to return to the land. This is not a text that hopes the Jews will get back to the land in order to have sovereignty, and in the future they'll be able to save themselves that way. This is a book that seems very comfortable with a diaspora lifestyle. What does that have to say to us today? How should we read that part of the text? Is this a text that loves the diaspora, wants Jews to live in the diaspora, Or is it saying something a little bit more complicated than that? This is also a book named after a woman, Esther. And there's another very important female character in this book, the original Queen Vashti. Who are these two female characters? Are they two different paradigms of what the Bible believes femininity could look like? What are we supposed to learn from them as they stand up for themselves in different ways? How can we learn from the model of Vashti, and how can we learn from the model of Esther about how to be a heroine? Not to mention, if you're really reading this from a feminist perspective, what does this book tell us about beauty and our ways of feminine ways of using our bodies in order to get certain perks, make certain things happen, and what are the problems that arise from that type of beauty manipulation? And finally, this book asks some serious questions about power. What does it mean to be in a position, in a minority position in a big empire without any power? And what does it mean to seek power? At the end of this book, there's a uprising and the Jews actually go out and kill many, many, many Persians. What does that have to teach us about violence? What does it have to teach us today as American Jews or diaspora Jews who are living as minorities in a big culture? And what does it have to teach us, perhaps with the state of Israel now in existence, about the limits of our power and how we should use power when we have it? It is because of all of these questions that the Book of Esther is such a loved text. It also is read with great cantillation. It's read with characters. It's chanted out loud in a theatrical way. And of course, we all listen to it every year while dressed up in costume and eating delicious triangularly shaped cookies, triangle-shaped cookies. And that makes this text one of the most beloved and also one of the most interesting texts in the Jewish Bible.